It's ironic that today I've gone into psychology as a profession. When I was a kid, the biggest source of fear I had were stories about insane asylums and escaped mental patients. Today, I deal with psychiatry patients and psychiatric wards in hospitals. The scary world of the criminally insane that children believe in is not really true, but you never could have told me that as a pre-teenager. Now, my dad and my older brother were the type who'd like to try and scare me as much as possible. I don't think they ever truly meant me any harm. They were just the type who enjoyed scaring people late at night and thought that was very normal. I remember such things as the time when my brother bought a Freddy Krueger glove and hid underneath my bed, then extended his hand out from underneath to grab me. That almost made me wet the bed. There was also that time we were watching Child's Play, and he threw one of my baby dolls at me halfway through the film. By far the worst one for my brother that I can remember, though, was when I was watching a zombie movie with my friends. I was sitting on the couch by the window. Unbeknownst to me, he'd taken the screen out and reached in to grab my shoulders, then groaned brains. I screamed, jumped off the couch, and ran up the stairs in 3 strides to make it to my room. He had a very good laugh over all those pranks, and after getting over the initial annoyance, I had to admit they were somewhat good jokes. When I was 14, my dad finally bought a house out in rural Virginia. Being someone that had been used to living in northern urban areas, I was not very pleased. I also wasn't very happy with the house itself either. It was very old and unkempt as well. My dad was always the type to buy fixer-uppers, then never actually try to fix them up. This meant it was just an old house and was not going to be likely any better than it had been when we'd first gotten it. I wasn't very familiar with the area either. When I asked my dad why he'd chosen to move there, he told me it was because he'd gotten a good deal on the house. I continued to ponder why he'd gotten such a good deal on a house in the country. He told me no one wanted to live there because of an old insane asylum kept out in the hills. People were always worried that escaped prisoners would break into their houses and do hideous things to their families. Nowadays, looking back, I know that's complete nonsense, but I was a teenager with a healthy fear of mental patients, so I really believed that could happen. Being given the choice for the rooms in the house, I chose an odd windowless room that was set slightly lower than the rest. I liked it because it had no windows. There was also one set of 5 steep wooden stairs that led up to the main part of the house. While this may seem like a choice some idiot in a horror film might make, I actually had a valid reason. Without windows down there, I wouldn't have to worry about who might be peeping in on me. I could put my bed across the room from the stairs and always keep an eye on the only way in and out. As a plus as well, the stairs creaked so loudly when anyone walked on them, there was no chance anyone was going to come down and surprise me. The floors were very old hardwood that creaked so loudly no matter how softly you walked on them, you could never be quiet. Practically though, this meant that I would always know whenever my dad or brother were coming in to try and scare me. Yeah, you're probably thinking I'm a wuss. Listen to this though. I'd rather be overly cautious and living than be an idiot who hears a noise in the next room and investigates to get killed. For the most part, it was less a matter of protecting myself from mental patients than letting my dad or brother surprise and scare me though. I guess for anyone listening who has a family that doesn't enjoy frightening them for no reason, you might not understand what I mean. Well, we lived in the house for a while without incident. My family kept up with the stories about the asylum, but they became less and less scary over time. The nights went by without anything ever actually happening. I came to the conclusion that that whole asylum thing had just been made up. Late one night in July, about 4 months after we had moved in, I was just laying in my room reading a book. I tended to stay up rather late, much later than the rest of my family actually. At about 1 o'clock in the morning though, I finally decided to get some rest. Stage 1 sleep is what we call that period of time when you first begin drifting off. You know what I mean, the time when you never remember anything unless something brings you out of it. That time your mind thinks weird things you won't remember in the morning. Well, something brought me out of my sleep. I wasn't quite sure what it was at first. I knew I must have heard something, but I had no idea what it could possibly be. I heard it once more though, a creaking noise, the very distinct creak one would hear if someone were walking down some old wooden stairs. My heart felt like it stopped for a moment. It actually felt like it paused, as a million things rushed through my head. My first instinct was to turn on the lamp by my bedside right away. The sound was coming from the stairs, so if I could get the light on before anyone got all the way down, I'd see who it was. I quickly moved my body over and flipped on the lamp right away. I also jumped out of my bed, causing my own feet to creak as they hit the hardwood floor. Looking over at the stairs exactly where the sound had come from, I saw nothing. I walked very slowly over to the stairwell and looked upward. The door was not only closed still, it was also locked just like I had left it. I paced there for a while, causing the floor to continue creaking. Once I'd calmed down enough, I decided it must have just been the house settling, so I went back to bed. I wasn't necessarily relaxed though. When I turned the lights off, I couldn't drift off into sleep as quickly as I had before. About 15 minutes after I'd laid down, I opened my eyes and looked over at the clock. I sighed. Simultaneously with that sigh though, I heard the noise once more. The same noise coming from the same area. My heart began to race, thinking about what this could possibly be. The noise was once again coming from the direction of the stairwell, but I hadn't heard the door open. I began to think that the sound must be coming from some other part of the house, because no one could have come down there without being noticed. When I heard the creak once more, an unpleasant thought suddenly occurred to me. The sound was coming from the stairs, but those stairs were right beside my closet door. I had checked the closet before going to bed, but if someone had entered my room in the meanwhile, when I would have written it off the first time, they could have easily slipped inside. It had a regular swinging door on it, and I always checked it before going to bed. I heard the sound once more. I flipped over and turned the light on. Then I jumped off my bed, my feet hitting the floor and making a loud, crazy noise for the second time. I wanted anyone who was in there to be aware I was now listening. As I slowly walked over to the closet door, my mind created all sorts of weird images. My imagination was flooded with images of escaped mental patients hiding inside, waiting to attack me. Now, this time, I really felt like an idiot from a horror film, but I knew that if someone was in my closet, there was no way I could just go to sleep now. I approached the door slowly and placed my hand on the knob. I was completely convinced I was going to open that door and see some hideous, deformed maniac sitting on the floor looking up at me with a sick, toothless grin. My heart beat harder and harder in my chest as I held my hand on the knob. I did my best to gather up all the courage I could to rival the heavy beating of my heart. I cleared my mind of all these sick images. I turned the knob until it clicked, assuming it would be better to just get this over with. As I flung the door open, I could see the closet was empty, other than my clothes and shoes. Looking behind everything, I saw my closet was not harboring some insane psychopath. I closed the door and latched it. Then I glanced over at the door on top of the stairwell. That door was locked and latched as well, just like I'd left it. I walked back to my bed mildly worried and extremely confused. I even lowered myself down to my knees and peeked under my bed. It was silly as the noise couldn't possibly be coming from underneath there, but I still had to check. Also empty. I got back into bed and took a bit longer to calm myself down this time. At about 2:15 a.m., I was finally calm enough to try and sleep again. Lying back in bed, I began to fall off into sleep until a sound woke me up once more. Another creaking noise. I turned and looked at the clock. It was now 3:15 a.m., an hour after I'd gone back to bed. The creaking was once again approaching from the stairwell area. My breathing picked up faster, and I wondered if maybe I should just pretend to be asleep this time. I'd hit the floor the previous times to warn any possible intruders I knew they were there. Maybe that was the wrong way to go about this. What changed my mind about pretending to be asleep was the next noise. Not a creaking sound. It was a loud hit and cracking noise that caused my nervous system to almost jump right out of me. For the third time that night, I jumped up and turned on the light, scanning the room. Immediately, I could see what was causing the noises. Coming out of the floor underneath by the stairwell were the blades of what I assumed to be a pair of hedge clippers. It was as if they were being thrust upward through the floor from underneath. They were moving faster than I had ever moved before. I jumped out of bed, cleared the 5 steps in 2 lengths, and ran up to the door screaming. My family all jumped out of bed, and when I told them what happened, I half expected them to tell me they were playing a prank on me. Instead, we heard a loud crack coming from downstairs, and my parents called the police. It might make this story a complete circle if I told you it was a prank or there really was an insane asylum patient. The truth was scary enough without those details, though. A drifter had snuck into the area and gotten into the crawl space, trying to break into the house. They'd chosen my room because there were no windows. He assumed it must be a pantry or a shed. He'd gotten stuck underneath and couldn't bring himself out. He grabbed the clippers to try and get himself out by cutting a hole in the cheap wooden floor. Every time I jumped, he'd heard the creaking of my feet. That's why he stopped and waited for me to go back to sleep. I could try and scare you by telling you the man was an escaped mental patient who had been waiting to torment me and kill me. But that's not true. I could tell you he was a creepy homeless man that wanted to torture me. What I will tell you, though, is when I asked my dad why the man had taken hedge clippers into the crawl space with him, for the first time ever, he did not try to scare me. A little backstory leading up to this meeting. I grew up in a pretty shady area and would rarely leave home after 7 or 8 p.m. That was around the time it was considered dangerous. Going into high school, I'd also gotten a pit bull. He was a gentle giant who loved everyone and everything. He had some protection work training before he joined our family, but as he was getting older, he'd retired and I took him home with me. On to the actual story. I was around this time a 17-year-old, short, blonde, and very aware of my size. Having a big scary dog along though, I finally felt safe walking alone, and on that very night I set out to take a longer walk with my dog. Let's call him Meatball. He really needed to run off some energy. To do this, I took him out into the woods nearby my home, and we walked along a gravel path that was partially lit. It was around 11 p.m. now, and quite dark outside. As we continued to walk along, I became very aware of the fact there wasn't really anyone else around. We walked for about 10 to 15 minutes before suddenly a man appeared from behind us. We continued to walk on, and I noticed he was taking the exact same turns as Meatball and I. I sped up a bit, feeling my heart begin to beat fast in my chest. Meatball, who would normally just spend his time sniffing at the end of the leash, also now seemed to be very aware of this situation. He had slowed down to walk beside me, gotten close to my leg, and began to stare at the man. I started to take every turn I could, and the man continued to follow, even though we were now just walking in circles together. He started to gain on us and get closer and closer. I was sure he was after me. I remembered in that moment something my father had once told me. Never let someone follow you. You're most vulnerable from behind. If you get into a situation where you can force your stalker to pass you, do so. I stopped in place and grabbed onto Meatball's leash. I leaned back, acting as if I had to put my entire body weight in just to hold him back. I was aware at this point in my life that I looked very small and weak. My father was an old veteran though, and he'd taught me to fight before I could even walk. Even holding Meatball back was not taking nearly as much effort as it looked. I called out, trying to sound as naive as I could, hoping that if I did have to fight, I would surprise him with my strength. Excuse me, sir, my dog doesn't really like people and I can't really hold him back when he lunges. If I step off to the side, could you pass us by so I have a chance to hold him back? As I said this, Meatball began to bark and growl and snap at the man. He stopped and looked me up and down. then stared at Meatball. He stood there for a few moments before suddenly turning around, not saying a single word. He began to sprint off into the distance. I called my parents and asked them to meet me, as I realized he could easily hide anywhere on our walk back. My dad showed up a few minutes later, baseball bat in hand. Nothing really happened afterward, but after being followed by this man at every turn I took for 40 minutes, I knew this could have ended really badly if I had not had Meatball with me, and my dad had not been so close by. Let me preface this by saying I work in a well-populated town with a low crime rate, and no reason to outright assume any of these actions were what I later found out to be sex trafficking attempts. I work at a popular coffee chain, generally doing afternoon and closing shifts. This night in particular, we had a very young crew for the closing, which happened at 10:30 p.m. We had our shift lead, 19 and female, who we'll call Sarah, myself, 17 and female, and my coworker, 17 and female as well, who we'll call Mia. There was also another girl called Dee there. It had been a relatively slow night with only a few loyal regulars dropping by. Both the drive-thru and cafe were empty, as heavy rainfall had started, and no one wanted to be out. I was in the front of the store cleaning, while the rest of my coworkers were in the back. An old man walked inside. He wore odd clothing, which was a bit strange for the humid weather. Full black attire with combat boots, a heavy red jacket, and a beanie obscuring his hair. I brushed it off as protection from the storm and figured he must work outside or something. I went to ask if he had placed an online order as he stood at the mobile counter. Putting on my best customer service voice, I smiled and went through my standard spiel. I was alarmed when, instead of responding, he placed a bag on the counter and started pulling out some DVDs. Once he finished pulling out a stack of 10 or so, he stared past me into the back room, where my coworkers were obliviously chatting. Then he began to make a lap around the store, eyeing me the entire time and not saying a word. Eventually, he backed out the front door and walked out to his truck, which I could now see was a large black pickup. Freaked the hell out by this behavior, obviously, I stupidly grabbed the stack of DVDs and ran back to my coworkers. They were immediately alarmed by my demeanor and asked me what was wrong. I held out the DVDs and let them inspect them while I explained what I had witnessed. Much to my discomfort, Sarah pointed out that all these movies seemed to be about either murders or kidnappings. Pissed off and feeling weird, we decided to call my manager. He picked up and Sarah explained the situation, while I comforted Dee and Mia, who were freaked out, probably more so than me at the time. Still though, there was nothing we could really do about it, except to call back if anything else happened. We hung up and moved back to the front of the store as a group. Things went on as usual, but now there was an air of fear about us. Mia stuck to my side and Dee to Sarah's. The man's truck had clearly pulled away earlier, but much to my dismay, I could see it had now pulled into the closed grocery store next door. As well, it seemed to have a clear view into the drive-thru window. A few cars pulled into the drive-thru in the meantime. I even had a few customers ask if I was alright, due to what I assumed to be my terrified face. I've always had a pretty good intuition about things. This felt more wrong than anything else I'd ever felt. More time passed by, and now it was time for Dee to leave. I could see the man was still waiting in the parking lot next door. We decided it would be best to call her boyfriend instead of letting her go out on her own. This wasn't an irregular occurrence, and we didn't want the man to follow her or something. Mia also noticed that a van had been sitting in back of the parking lot for almost an hour at this point, which none of us had noticed previously. Another gut feeling hit, and I made the decision to now lock the door. Dee's boyfriend, Daniel, told her he was on the way, and I informed my manager we had locked the cafe for peace of mind. He was fine with that as business had been so slow that night. Sarah and Dee were in the back now. Mia and I were up front. I went about cleaning the machines and trying to make idle chatter to keep us calm, which was no small feat. She jumped up every time she heard someone steaming milk or something. As we were talking and I had my back turned to her, she screamed mid-sentence, "Get out!" Alarmed, I whipped around, only to see a shadowy figure attempting to climb in through the drive-thru window. The next few moments were a blur of adrenaline-rushed thinking, and what I can only explain as extreme divine intervention. Grabbing her arm, I yanked Mia behind me. I grabbed the hot bucket of sanitizer I had been using to scrub the counters around the machines and poured the liquid onto the man. I simultaneously used the bucket to smack the man and push him out the window, which he only had his shoulders through so far. I slammed the bucket down on his head, too. At the same time, Daniel happened to pull up outside. Mia was now yelling for someone to call the police. I saw Dee in my peripheral, running outside to her new savior. I slammed the drive-thru window shut and locked them up, with the man still laying on the ground struggling to get his bearings. I couldn't tell you how much time had passed. Couldn't have been more than 15 or 30 seconds. I saw Daniel rush the man, who was now on his knees, and pin him to the ground. Sarah and Mia were now pulling me back to the back of the store, with both fighting back sobs, and Sarah on the phone with the police. Thankfully, some of our regulars happened to be deputies, and they arrived within 5 minutes of our call. They arrested the man too. The aftermath was messy. They eventually pinned him as a member of a local trafficking ring that had been caught years prior and let out on bail. Oh yeah, the van in the back that we had noticed, it hightailed it out of the parking lot immediately as soon as the police arrived. Eventually, it was traced back to people who were also part of that ring. Even though I won't be releasing names or such as legal proceedings are still happening, I figured I would share my story here. I still work there and I'm very grateful for Daniel, who very well could have saved all our lives in that moment. He managed to keep the man pinned the entire time until police arrived and disarmed him. Really the true hero of this story, although I do pride myself on my quick thinking for managing to shove the man out of the store. Moral of the story is trust your gut feelings and always have a steaming hot bucket of sanitizer on hand. This is a story from around 10 years ago. I was 16 or 17 at the time. At the time, I kind of brushed this off because nothing bad ended up happening to me. I tried to put it down to, I guess shit just happens to you when you're a woman walking alone at night. But looking back, I realize how creepy it really was. I was coming home on my own on a Thursday night after being out at the pub with some friends. We had been out a little more centrally in the city, so I had to take a bus on my own to get home to my residential neighborhood. I had done this route hundreds of times before, so I didn't see it as being particularly dangerous, especially as I lived in a fairly nice neighborhood. It was only around 11 p.m., but because I lived in a residential area and it was in the middle of the working week, as I got off my bus at my stop, it was absolutely dead, not a single soul around. This didn't really spook me though. It was only about a 5 to 10 minute walk from the stop to my house. As I turned down a long residential street that led towards my home, I noticed a man walking a bit further down the street. This put me a little bit on edge, but I was reassured by the fact that he had his back turned toward me and was also walking away from me down the street. Probably just a random guy getting home as well or something. I kept on walking when I noticed the man suddenly turn around and clock his eyes on me. That was kind of strange, I thought. I guess though that I always did turn around as well when I heard someone walking behind me at night, so not really anything weird by that. I noticed though as we got further and further down the street that he kept on doing this, checking that I was still walking in the same direction as him. At this point, I was starting to get pretty freaked out, particularly as I was now painfully aware we were the only two people around. Just as I was weighing what I should do though, he turned down the path of one of the houses to our right, and I breathed a big sigh of relief. So the man really was going to his house. I was just being paranoid the whole time. Heck, maybe he even thought I was following him. The houses in my area are terraced with the front doors being kind of embedded into an enclave at the front of the house. This means that from where I was standing, I couldn't actually see the man entering the house as it was obscured by a wall. I did see him walk down the path and disappear into the front door enclave though, so my logical conclusion was that this must be his house. I can't exactly describe what made me feel like this, but after that initial feeling of relief wore off, I suddenly got this very bad feeling. I stopped walking and just kind of stood there. There was this tiny voice in my head that said, "What if he's just trying to fake you out?" The feeling became so strong that I stepped off the pavement and ducked down to hide behind a parked car and just kind of waited there. After about 10 minutes of crouching behind this car staring at the home, I saw movement and my heart stopped. The man came back down the path, out onto the street, and was obviously looking around searching for me. He must have been waiting for me in that doorway, knowing that if I kept on walking, I wouldn't be able to see him until it was too late. Unfortunately for him though, his hiding place also meant he couldn't see me. When I hadn't walked past him as he'd anticipated, he came back out into the street to try and work out where I had gone. Looking back now, I probably should have called the police at this point, but as a scared teenager, my fight-or-flight brain took over. I sprinted down one of the roads running perpendicular to the street we were on, as I knew I could use it to take a slightly longer route home. I didn't stop running until I finally arrived home. I quickly double-locked the door behind me. Amazingly, I didn't even think I woke anyone in my family up. I just ran up to bed, then woke up the next morning and went to school like nothing ever happened. I dread, though, to think what might have happened if I hadn't suddenly felt that bad feeling and stopped walking. Part of me thinks, on some subconscious level, my brain must have registered not hearing the front door shut or something after the man had approached it. I wasn't really consciously thinking of this at the time, but I really learned my lesson to trust your gut.